We were staying in a small cabin deep in the woods, far away from everything. My husband and I thought it would be the perfect getaway, a chance to relax and forget about the noise of the city and our busy lives. The rain had started early that evening, soft at first, but now it was pouring hard, slamming against the tin roof. At first, the sound was calming, but as the night went on, it felt heavier, like it was trying to cover up everything else. The cabin was small but comfortable, with one main room and a tiny bedroom in the back. We had brought everything we needed, so there was no reason to step outside, especially with the storm. My husband had started a fire earlier, and it filled the room with flickering light. I sat on the couch, staring at the flames. The quietness of the woods felt strange, almost too still, but I tried to enjoy it. Still, something didn't feel right. I told myself it was just my nerves, not being used to this kind of silence. I glanced over at my husband. He was in a chair by the fire, half asleep and snoring softly. I told myself we were safe. Then I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost drowned out by the rain. A light tapping sound on the side of the cabin. I froze, listening. It happened again, slower this time, like someone was gently knocking. I stood up, my chest tightening. I walked to the window and tried to look out, but the rain running down the glass made it hard to see. I could barely make out the shapes of the trees swaying in the wind. No movement, no figure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there. Then the sound came again, louder and closer this time. It wasn't on the side of the cabin anymore. It was at the front door. A cold wave of fear ran through me. I stayed where I was, frozen, listening. My husband shifted in his chair but didn't wake up. The sound changed. The door handle rattled slightly, like someone was testing it. My breath caught in my throat, and I crept toward the door as quietly as I could. The lock was still in place, and I let out a small breath of relief. Then the noise stopped. The only sounds left were the rain pounding on the roof and the crackling of the fire. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, but nothing happened. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me. I went back to the couch, but I couldn't relax. My eyes kept darting to the windows and the dark corners of the cabin. Every shadow felt like it was moving. My nerves were completely shot. And then, through the rain, I heard it. A soft crunching noise, like someone stepping on wet leaves. My stomach sank. Someone was out there walking around the cabin. I rushed over to my husband and shook him awake. He opened his eyes, confused, but I didn't explain. I grabbed the flashlight we had brought and turned it on. I shined the beam through the window, moving it across the trees. The light caught the rain and branches, but there was no one in sight. I pointed the light toward the ground, and my heart dropped. There were footprints in the mud, fresh ones, leading from the front door around the side of the cabin. They disappeared into the darkness beyond the light's reach. Neither of us slept that night. We sat by the fire, the flashlight in my lap and a knife in my husband's hand, listening to the rain and every little creak of the cabin. I kept staring at the windows, expecting a face to appear. The rain didn't let up, and by morning, it had washed away the tracks. The forest was silent, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like it was holding its breath. We packed our things quickly and left, not saying much to each other. As we walked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder. I felt like we were being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. Even now, months later, I can't forget that night. I still hear the tapping sometimes, even when it's not raining. And sometimes, when I look out my window at home, I swear I see footprints in the dirt outside, leading to my door. Last year, I went to visit my uncle in South America. He and his best friend had built a small cabin deep in the forest. They used it as a spot to stay during their hunting and fishing trips. When he asked me to come spend a week there with him, I said yes right away. I wanted to get away from the city for a while, and being in the middle of nature sounded perfect to me. The first few days were peaceful. The cabin was simple. One big room with some bunk beds, a tiny kitchen area, and a wood stove. At night, the forest would come alive with sounds. Crickets chirping, frogs croaking, and leaves rustling here and there. My uncle said it was just animals moving around. I believed him and didn't think much of it. On the fourth night, his best friend joined us. He didn't talk much, but he was easy to be around. We spent the evening cooking over the fire outside and listening to my uncle's hunting stories. When it started to get colder, we went inside, locked the door, and got into our bunks. The fire in the wood stove crackled softly, and I quickly drifted off to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange noise. It was faint but steady, like someone lightly tapping on the wooden walls of the cabin. I stayed in bed, listening. At first, I thought it might be a tree branch moving in the wind, but the air outside was completely still. The tapping stopped for a moment, then started again, this time closer to the window. My chest tightened, and my heart started racing. I looked over at my uncle and his friend. They were both sound asleep. I didn't want to wake them up over something that could be nothing, so I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and pointed it at the window. The beam lit up the darkness outside, showing only the trees and bushes. I didn't see anything out of place, but the feeling of being watched crept over me. I lay back down, telling myself it was nothing, probably just an animal. But just as I was about to fall asleep again, the noise changed. It wasn't tapping anymore. It sounded like scratching, slow, deliberate, moving along the wall near my bed. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. My eyes stayed on the ceiling, my breathing shallow as I tried not to make a sound. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light came through the window, I sat up and told my uncle about what I'd heard. He just shrugged and said it was probably a raccoon or something. He and his friend headed out to check their traps while I stayed behind to clean up the cabin. I tried to keep busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every now and then, I felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me from somewhere in the trees. Later that day, we found tracks in the dirt near the cabin. They didn't belong to any animal I knew. They looked human, but the person was barefoot, and the steps were uneven, like whoever it was had a limp. My uncle and his friend exchanged a quick look but didn't say much. I could tell they didn't like what they saw. That night, we stayed inside. My uncle kept his rifle close, and we let the fire burn brighter than usual. The hours dragged on, and nothing happened at first. I started to convince myself it was all in my head. But just before dawn, we heard it. Heavy footsteps outside, circling the cabin. The steps were slow and steady, stopping every few seconds before starting again. My uncle motioned for us to stay quiet and still. The steps stopped right outside the door, and then we heard the sound of the door handle rattling, like someone was trying to open it. My uncle's friend grabbed a knife and stood ready. My uncle aimed his rifle at the door, but none of us moved a muscle. After what felt like forever, the rattling stopped. The footsteps started again, circling the cabin once more before fading into the trees. None of us slept after that. We stayed awake, listening until the sun finally rose. When we stepped outside, we saw deep footprints all around the cabin. They went in circles over and over before disappearing into the forest. We packed up right then and left. My uncle didn't say much on the drive back to town, but I could tell he was shaken. He later told me he didn't plan on going back to that cabin anytime soon. Even now, I still think about what happened. I know those weren't animal tracks, and the sounds that night weren't random. Someone or something was out there watching us, playing with us. I'll never forget the way those footsteps stopped by the door, like whoever it was knew we were inside and wanted us to know they could get in if they wanted to. Whatever it was, it didn't follow us back. At least, I don't think it did. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I hear footsteps outside my window, slow and steady, just like that night. I was 29 when it happened, just a few months into being a cop. I'd rented a small cabin up north to get some peace and quiet. The city was wearing me out, and I thought a weekend away might help clear my head. The cabin was far out, surrounded by thick forest, with just a narrow dirt road leading up to it. It was the kind of place where every little sound stood out: the wind in the trees, the creaking of branches, and the occasional rustling in the bushes. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I didn't sleep much. It felt like the calm before something bad, but I told myself I was just being jumpy. I wasn't used to being out in the middle of nowhere. The second night, though, things changed. Started with a dull sound, like something hitting wood. I was lying on the couch, flipping through a book when I heard it. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't random either. I froze and waited, trying to figure out where it came from. Then it came again, closer. It sounded like footsteps, slow and steady, moving across the wooden porch outside. I switched off the lamp, leaving the room in the dark. My heart was pounding in my chest. I felt stupid for not bringing my gun, but this was supposed to be a break, not a work trip. I crawled to the window and barely pulled the curtain back, just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty, but something didn't feel right. That kind of wrong where every part of you is screaming to get out. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed up, listening to every creak, every snap outside. Nothing else happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my stuff fast, but as I went to load the car, I noticed something strange. On the ground near the porch were footprints, big ones, barefoot, and they definitely hadn't been there yesterday. I stared at them for a while, trying to make sense of it, when I heard a snap from the woods. It sounded like a branch breaking under someone's weight. It was close, too close. I didn't stick around to see what or who it was. I grabbed my bag, tossed it into the car, and got out of there, speeding down the bumpy dirt road as fast as I could. A few miles out, I stopped at a small gas station. I called the local sheriff, hoping for some answers. I explained what happened and asked if anyone had reported people hanging around in the area. He paused before saying, "Not exactly people. We've had reports of squatters or drifters in those woods. Probably best you stay away from there." That was the last time I went near that cabin. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, especially the footprints. They didn't feel right. They were too big, too exact. Whatever made them wasn't just wandering by. For weeks after, I kept imagining someone, or something, standing just out of sight, watching me as I packed, as I ran. They weren't in a hurry. They didn't need to be. They wanted me to know they were there. Even now, years later, I think about how close I was to whatever it was. What if I'd stayed another night? What if I hadn't packed so quickly? I still see those footprints in my head, and I can't shake the thought that whatever made them wasn't done with me. Maybe it's still waiting out there, somewhere watching and waiting for someone else to make the mistake of staying too long. I was working at a border post in Arizona, out in the middle of the desert. The cabin I stayed in was small and simple, just a bed, a table, and a stove. It wasn't much, but it did the job. My task was to keep an eye out for illegal crossings and anything unusual. Most days were slow, and it was just me and the desert for miles. The cabin was far from everything. The closest town was hours away, and once the sun went down, the desert became pitch black. If you stepped outside at night, you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. The wind would whistle through cracks in the cabin walls, sometimes making it sound like the place was alive. It was eerie, but I'd gotten used to it. One night, I was looking out over the desert with my binoculars. The moon gave just enough light to see the shapes of cacti and rocks in the distance. As I scanned the horizon, I saw something move, a shadow darting between some bushes. I stopped and stared, trying to make sense of it. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. I lowered the binoculars, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. It was gone. I figured it was just the wind messing with my eyes. But a while later, I heard a soft tapping noise outside. It was faint, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on the wooden walls of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the cold night air. My light swept across the desert, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no movement, just the sound of the wind blowing through the empty landscape. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat down at the table. My ears were on high alert, listening for anything out of place. Hours passed, and the silence felt heavier than usual. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it wasn't tapping. It was a scraping sound, like metal dragging against wood. It was coming from the back of the cabin. I froze. My stomach dropped, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to go outside again, but I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and my weapon, slowly made my way to the back door, and opened it. The cold air hit me, and I shined my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing, just the same empty desert stretching out in all directions. But then I noticed something in the sand, boot prints, fresh ones. They led away from the cabin toward a nearby ridge. My chest tightened. Someone had been here. I followed the tracks for a short distance, my flashlight flickering in the wind. They went up to the ridge and then just stopped, like whoever it was had vanished into thin air. My mouth felt dry as I turned around and made my way back to the cabin, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I got back, the door to the cabin was wide open. I knew I had locked it. Inside, nothing looked out of place at first. But then I saw something on the table that hadn't been there before. A single bullet. It wasn't mine. My hands shook as I picked it up, my mind racing. This wasn't just a random bullet. It was a warning. The next day, I told my supervisor what had happened. They sent someone out to check the area, but by then, the tracks were gone. There wasn't much they could do. They told me to stay alert and report anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The week dragged on. Every night, I expected to hear the tapping or scraping again. I kept the doors locked, barely sleeping, listening for any sound. But nothing happened. When my shift was finally over, I packed my things and left without looking back. A few months later, I came across a report about a smuggler caught near the area where I'd been stationed. The man was armed and had been known for leaving warnings behind for anyone who got in his way. A single bullet was his signature. But what the report didn't explain was why his tracks stopped so suddenly that night or how he'd managed to get inside my locked cabin. And as much as I wanted to move on, I couldn't forget the feeling I had when I held that bullet. It wasn't just a warning. It felt like a promise. The cabin trip was supposed to help me take a break from everything. My gym buddy, Steve, brought it up one day after we finished a workout. He said it would be good to get away for a while, and I agreed. A weekend of fresh air and quiet sounded perfect after the weeks of stress I'd been dealing with. We rented a small cabin deep in the woods, far away from phone service and the noise of daily life. The drive there was uneventful. By the time we arrived, the sun was already sinking low, and the trees cast long, dark shadows over the dirt road. The cabin itself was tiny but nice enough. It had a small stove for heat, a couple of chairs, and one bedroom. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what we needed, simple and away from everything. That first night, we started a fire, grilled some food, and spent the evening talking about our workouts and random stuff. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a while, I felt myself relax. By midnight, we decided to head to bed. Steve took the bed while I unrolled my sleeping bag on the couch in the main room. The forest outside was silent except for the occasional sound of leaves moving in the breeze. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Everything felt off. The air inside the cabin was colder than before, and I could hear faint noises coming from outside. It sounded like something moving through the leaves. I figured it was probably an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a deer. I stayed still and listened, waiting for the sound to fade. But it didn't. Kept going like something or someone was walking slowly around the cabin. I sat up carefully, trying not to make any noise. The small window near the couch faced the porch, so I leaned slightly to get a look. The moonlight lit up the porch, but I didn't see anything out of place. I thought about waking Steve, but decided not to. It was probably just the wind or some curious animal. Forcing myself to lie back down, I tried to sleep, though it didn't come easy. The next morning, I mentioned the sounds to Steve. He just shrugged and said it was probably normal for a place like this. We spent the day hiking a nearby trail and cutting some wood for the fire. Everything felt normal, and by the time the sun set again, I had mostly pushed the strange noises from my mind. That night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a sound that woke me. It was a feeling, that unsettling sense you get when someone is watching you. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding, and strained to listen. The rustling noise was back, but it was closer now, right outside the cabin. I sat up slowly, feeling like every movement I made was too loud. I turned to look out the window, hoping I wouldn't see anything. But then I did. There was a figure crouched low near the edge of the porch. I could barely make them out in the dim light, but they weren't moving, just sitting there, looking at the cabin. I froze. My stomach tightened, and I didn't dare breathe. It wasn't an animal, it was a person. They didn't have a flashlight or anything with them, just crouched there in the dark like they belonged to it. I didn't know if they could see me, and I didn't want to find out. I stayed as still as possible, watching them. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Finally, they stood up and moved back into the trees. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Steve what I had seen. At first, he didn't believe me, but my expression must have convinced him I wasn't joking. We decided not to stay another night. As we packed up, we tried to tell ourselves it was just some random hiker who had gotten lost. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. They didn't look lost. They looked like they were waiting for something. We loaded the car in silence. As we were about to leave, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. Something on the porch caught my eye. I walked over, my heart racing, and saw what it was, a knife. It was old and covered in rust, but the blade was sharp. Too sharp for something that had just been lying around. I stared at it for a while before picking it up. There were deep scratches on the handle, like someone had been gripping it too tightly. I showed it to Steve, and we didn't say a word. We just got in the car and drove away as fast as we could. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been outside the cabin wasn't just watching us. They had been planning something. Leaving that knife wasn't an accident. It was a message, a reminder that they could have done something but chose not to. This time. I had been wanting some peace and quiet away from the noise of the city, so I rented a small cabin in the mountains of northern England. The ad for the cabin was simple, basic setup, far away from people and beautiful views. That sounded perfect to me. When I got there, it looked just like I hoped. A small stone cabin with one floor, surrounded by trees, and a clear view of the nearby mountains. Felt peaceful, maybe even too peaceful. The first evening went by without anything unusual. I started a fire, made some dinner, and spent hours watching the sky get darker through the big living room window. By the time it was fully night, the silence felt heavy, like the whole world had gone still. I didn't think much of it then, but it stuck with me as I went to bed. It felt like the quiet outside was pressing in on the cabin, like a heavy blanket. I woke up in the middle of the night. My phone, sitting on the bedside table, said it was just after 3 a.m. The fire had burned out, and the cabin was completely dark. I tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard something. It was faint, like a soft scraping sound coming from outside. I figured it was probably a tree branch brushing against the stone wall, or maybe a small animal looking for food. But the noise didn't stop. It moved, slowly, along the side of the cabin, like someone or something was dragging something sharp against the wall. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and walked to the window. The moonlight wasn't very bright, but I could see the trees swaying slightly in the breeze. I couldn't see anything unusual. Telling myself not to overthink it, I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I stepped outside and noticed something strange on the side of the cabin. There were long, thin scratches along the stone wall near the window. They weren't deep, but they were fresh. I looked around the clearing for tracks, but the ground was hard and covered in leaves, so I didn't find anything. It bugged me, but I told myself it must have been a branch after all. That afternoon, I went for a hike on a trail near the cabin. The views were amazing, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It wasn't a clear sense, just that prickly feeling you get on the back of your neck. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. It was unsettling. When I got back to the cabin, I saw something on the porch. At first, I thought it was a pile of mud, small and dark. But when I got closer, I realized it was an animal's paw. Just the paw. It looked like it had been cut clean off, no blood, just the stump. It was too big to belong to a rabbit or fox. Maybe a badger? My stomach twisted as I stared at it. I looked toward the woods, but nothing moved. That night, I locked the door and checked all the windows twice. The cabin didn't feel safe anymore. Felt like I was trapped in a box, waiting for something to happen. I sat by the fire with a knife from the kitchen, staring at the door. Hours passed, and then, around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. They weren't light, like an animal's. They were heavy and steady. They stopped right at the door. I froze. I didn't even breathe. I sat there, gripping the knife so tightly that my hands started to hurt. The sound of the footsteps stayed for what felt like hours, but it was probably just minutes. Then, slowly, they moved toward the window. I couldn't see much through the glass, just the glow of the fire reflecting back at me. But I could feel someone or something on the other side watching. Then, I heard a soft tapping on the window. It wasn't loud, just slow and steady, like nails brushing the glass. The tapping stopped suddenly, and I heard the footsteps move away, back toward the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't even bother with breakfast. As I was loading my car, I saw new scratches on the front door. They were deep and ran in long, straight lines, like something sharp had been dragged across it. I drove off as fast as I could, my heart racing. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out details, just a tall, motionless figure, watching me leave. I never went back to that cabin. When I tried to reach out to the owner to ask about the place, the listing had disappeared. It was like the cabin had never existed. To this day, I still think about that night. Sometimes, when I'm home alone, I hear faint tapping on the windows, just like before. And every time, I wonder if whatever was outside that cabin followed me home. I had been driving for hours, trying to get away from the noise and stress of city life. A coworker had told me about a small village tucked away in the hills, a place where everything seemed frozen in time. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just wanted a quiet weekend to myself. When I finally got there, the village was as peaceful as promised. Narrow dirt roads, old wooden houses, and thick forest all around. I found a small cabin for rent on the edge of the woods. It was simple but had all I needed: a bed, a fireplace, and a small kitchen. The first evening felt perfect. I made myself a quick meal, read a bit by the fire, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. As the sun went down, the quiet became almost too much. No cars, no voices, not even the sound of animals. Just the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. It felt strange, but I brushed it off. This was what I'd come for: peace and quiet. The next day, I decided to explore the forest behind the cabin. A trail led into the woods and I followed it for hours. The trees were so tall and thick that barely any sunlight got through. The air felt heavy, and everything seemed untouched, like no one had been there in years. At one point, I found what looked like an old campsite. There was a tent that had collapsed, rusty cooking gear, and a fire pit filled with ash. It gave me an uneasy feeling, like I shouldn't be there. I quickly turned around and headed back to the cabin, deciding to spend the rest of the day inside. That night, things started to feel different. As I lay in bed, I heard noises outside, branches breaking, something brushing against the walls of the cabin. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a deer wandering by, but the sounds didn't stop. They got louder, closer. I turned off the lights and looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. By the third day, I was ready to leave. Something about the place just felt wrong. It wasn't only the sounds. It was the way the few villagers I'd seen acted. Whenever I drove through the village, they just stared at me. No smiles, no waves. Just blank, tired looks. When I tried to start my car that morning, it wouldn't start. I checked everything I could think of, nothing worked. I decided to walk to the nearest house to ask for help. As I walked through the village, it felt completely empty. No kids playing, no one working outside. Just silence. I knocked on one door, no answer. Then another, and another. No one came to the door, no sound came from inside. It was like the whole village had been abandoned overnight. When I got back to the cabin, I saw that the front door was wide open. I knew I had locked it before leaving. Inside, everything looked the same, except for one thing. There were muddy footprints leading from the front door to the bedroom. My stomach tightened. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and searched the cabin. Every corner, every closet. No one was there. But the footprints, they didn't lead back outside. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of the living room, watching the door and windows. Around midnight, the noises started again. Branches snapping, something brushing against the walls. Then I heard a soft tapping on the window behind me. Top, top, top. My heart felt like it stopped. I didn't want to turn around, but the sound didn't stop. When I finally worked up the courage to look, there was nothing there, just the darkness. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of day broke, I packed my bag, left the cabin, and started walking down the dirt road. I didn't care about the car anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. As I walked, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. The front door was open again, and standing in the doorway was a man, or at least something shaped like a man. He didn't move, didn't call out. He just stood there watching me. I didn't stop. I kept walking, my legs trembling, my throat dry. I walked for what felt like hours before I reached a main road. A car finally stopped for me, and the driver let me in. When I tried to explain what had happened, he gave me a strange look. "That village," he said, "nobody's lived there for years. The last people left after some strange things happened. You're lucky to be out of there. Even now, I don't know what was in that cabin with me, or who. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think I hear that same tap 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 on my window, and I don't think it's the wind.